Remember when Dolph Lundgren towered over Rocky and one speech changed an entire Soviet arena? Behind the Cold War glory were real punches, a hospital stay, and one deeply personal secret. Today we're counting down 15 weird facts you never knew about Rocky IV. Number 15. You know the sequence. Rocky in the frozen wilderness, chopping wood, hauling logs uphill through snowdrifts, eventually screaming into the void from the peak of a mountain. It feels like the edge of Siberia. Here is the thing, it is not even close to Russia. With Cold War tensions making Soviet filming impossible, production went looking for the next best thing and found it in Jackson Hole, Wyoming, cinematographer Bill Butler, who had worked with Stallone on Rocky II and Rocky III. Shot the entire wilderness sequence against the backdrop of Grand Teton National Park, with temperatures dropping to around 10 degrees below zero at night. Heaters had to be strapped directly to the camera housings just to keep the equipment operational. The rustic log cabin where Rocky trains was built specifically for the film and later torn down. Around 40 Jackson Hole locals were hired as the Russian villagers visible in the background. Burt Young's fall into knee-deep snow was completely unplanned. That was the Wyoming winter making a cameo. Production designer Bill Kenny had to make an American National Park pass for the Soviet interior, and he pulled it off so convincingly that most viewers never questioned the geography. Here is the clue hiding in plain sight. In the shot of Rocky arriving at the Soviet airport, the mountain visible in the background is the Grand Teton. The arena where the final fight took place wasn't in Russia either, and it presented a completely different kind of challenge. Number 14. The climactic boxing sequence puts Rocky in a hostile Soviet coliseum. Thousands of jeering Russians fill every seat. Soviet officials watch in stone-faced displeasure. And then, slowly, the crowd turns. By the end, they are chanting Rocky's name in unison. It is one of the most emotionally satisfying crowd payoffs in sports film history. None of those people were Russian, and none of that was in Moscow. The venue was the PNE Agrodome at Hastings Park in Vancouver, an arena originally opened in 1963 that routinely hosts livestock exhibitions. Filming ran from roughly April 30th to May 9th, 1985. While the crew dressed the interior with faux Soviet trophy cases, Cyrillic restroom signs, and Russian-style Pepsi signage designed to sell a geography the building had nothing to do with. Thousands of Canadian extras were bussed in, given a free lunch and a small per-day charitable donation, then coached when to clap, when to whistle, and when to chant. Stallone reportedly personally warmed the crowd up before filming in character. And according to CBC archival accounts from the shoot, he told them Apollo was going to die and that this might be the last Rocky. He then asked them to cheer accordingly. That coach crowds gradually turning hostility into pure joy is the emotional engine of the finale. Every synchronized clap you hear is a Canadian volunteer following a cue. What nobody expected was that the man playing Drago had more intellectual horsepower than almost anyone in the building. Number 13. Drago on screen is cold, minimal, almost mechanical. He arrives, he dominates, he moves like a weapon built in a lab. It turns out that is not too far from who Dolph Lundgren actually is. Lundgren holds a master's degree in chemical engineering from the University of Sydney and was awarded a Fulbright scholarship to MIT before setting it aside to pursue acting. He speaks 5 languages. The machine Stallone put on screen was, in real life, a genuine intellect. When Stallone first conceived Drago, he had written him as, in his own words, an ape, a giant, Neanderthal, primitive and terrifying. Then he saw Lundgren. The character was immediately reconceived as the opposite, perfect, intelligent, forward-looking, a vision of the future rather than a relic of the past. Stallone said everyone is going to hate this guy because he has no flaws. He is 6'6" with no flaws. The decision to strip Drago's dialogue down to almost nothing came later, as Stallone realized the character's menace evaporated the more he explained himself. A real-life genius gave Drago an authentic, unnerving stillness that no amount of direction could have manufactured. This is why Drago works despite barely speaking. The quiet is not absence of character, it is a deliberate choice by a director who recognized that the most frightening thing on screen was what he did not say. Count Drago's actual lines when you next rewatch the film. There are almost none, and getting him on screen in the first place came down to a pop star and a single headshot. Number 12. Dolph Lundgren in 1985 was essentially nobody. He was a Swedish martial arts champion living in New York, working as a nightclub bouncer, dating pop megastar Grace Jones, and had recently appeared for roughly 10 seconds as a henchman in A View to a Kill, a role Jones helped him land. That was the extent of his film career. Rocky IV's casting process for Drago was reportedly an enormous undertaking, with accounts from Lundgren's official biography citing a search among several thousand hopefuls over roughly 9 months. Lundgren was turned away at an initial New York cattle call for being too tall. He later described the process as one of the longest of his career. The connection that actually changed everything was filmmaker John Hertzfeld, a Stallone friend, who brought Lundgren's headshot directly to Stallone. The photograph was so striking that Stallone immediately reconceived the role around the image. The rest was the physical audition. Lundgren's combination of genuine, athletic credibility, commanding size, and an unnerving stillness in front of a camera gave Stallone exactly the opponent Rocky needed. What makes this even more remarkable is that it was essentially Lundgren's first real screen performance in a lead capacity. The poise and menace you see in the finished film came from a man who had almost no acting experience and a chemical engineering degree sitting in a drawer. And Stallone was also personally motivated to cast someone else in the film for reasons that had nothing to do with the script. Number 11. Lyudmila Drago strides through Rocky IV as the icy, composed Soviet wife who defends her husband at every press conference with cold, rehearsed precision. She is a minor character in plot terms. In real-life terms, she was the center of Stallone's personal life. Brigitte Nielsen was Stallone's girlfriend and then fiancée during production. They married on December 15, 1985, weeks after the film's release, at producer Irwin Winkler's Beverly Hills home. Stallone wrote the role of Lyudmila specifically for her, and by several accounts. The decision was partly driven by a desire to keep her close during the shoot. Nielsen had reportedly gotten Stallone's attention by slipping her headshot under his hotel room door via a paid bellboy. She later described her time on set as chaotic, saying she was just an actress dating Stallone and that she wasn't even allowed to have an opinion. Their marriage lasted 19 months before ending in divorce in 1987. The 1985 theatrical cut gives Lyudmila a reasonable amount of screen time. Stallone's 2021 director's cut scaled her scenes back considerably. Whether this reflects a changed view of the character's importance or something more personal is left to interpretation. What is documented is that the off-screen romance directly shaped the film's casting. The same personal impulse was also behind the film's most mocked element, which turns out to be its most moving one. Number 10. For decades, Seiko, the talking robot that Rocky gives Paulie for his birthday, has been held up as the definitive example of 1980s action movie self-indulgence. A celebrity director putting his favorite toy on screen because no one could stop him. The full story is something else entirely. Seiko was a genuine, sophisticated robot built by Robert Dornick of International Robotics in New York. Stallone first encountered it after seeing Dornick discuss the robot's work with autistic children on television. Stallone's son Sergio had been diagnosed with autism in the early 1980s, and Dornick's robots had shown a remarkable ability to reach nonverbal children in ways humans sometimes could not. Stallone contacted Dornick, Seiko was brought into the family's life to help Sergio communicate, and Stallone was so moved by the robot's impact that he wrote Seiko directly into the film. Dornick operated and voiced Seiko on set. The robot was, in fact, a Screen Actors Guild member and reportedly toured with James Brown as a performer. Most of Stallone's additional Seiko scenes were cut before release. Siko was removed entirely from the 2021 director's cut, a decision Stallone attributed to wanting a tonally grounded film. Dornick suggested the SAG royalty payments factored in. What the audience dismissed as Hollywood excess was a father putting his son's therapist on the big screen. And speaking of James Brown, his performance almost didn't happen either. Number 9. Living in America opening a Rocky film feels inevitable now. James Brown at the top of his performance powers, Apollo Creed in a sequined Uncle Sam outfit, the crowd going absolutely wild. The whole sequence is so perfectly calibrated that it seems like it must have been planned from the start. It was not planned at all, and Brown was reluctant to do it. The Godfather of Soul had not charted on the Billboard Hot 100 since 1976. Living in America was written not by Brown, but by Dan Hartman and Charlie Midnight, commissioned specifically for the film. The entire MGM Grand Arena performance was a staged film set, not a real concert. Stallone personally arranged Brown's participation and reportedly convinced him the song would connect with a younger generation of fans who had never seen what Brown could do live. The gamble was not small. Asking a musical legend to perform someone else's material for a movie sequel requires a specific kind of persuasion. It worked beyond any reasonable projection. Living in America entered the Billboard Hot 100 Top 40 in January 1986, peaked at number 4 in March, and won James Brown the 1986 Grammy Award for Best Male R&B Vocal Performance. It was his first Hot 100 charting entry in a decade. The sequence that looks like an obvious creative choice was actually a last-minute cultural bet. And while Brown was reluctant, the man who scored the rest of the film got the job through even stranger circumstances. All right, we're at the halfway mark, and things are about to get even wilder. Before we hit the top 7, I want to hear from you. What's your favorite Rocky IV moment? Drop it in the comments. And if you're enjoying this, smash that like button and subscribe. It really does help the channel grow. Number 8. Rocky IV is the only film in the original Rocky series that does not feature Bill Conti's score. The composer behind Gonna Fly Now, the music that is perhaps more associated with Stallone's career than any other single piece of film music, was not on this production. And the man who replaced him was, for all practical purposes, a first-timer. Vince DiCola got the job through music supervisor Robin Garb, who told him Stallone had had a falling out with Conti over the direction of the score. DiCola was rooted in progressive rock and had played keyboards for bands influenced by Keith Emerson. He brought a synth-driven electronic sound that suited the film's Cold War machinery, cold and digital for Drago, warmer and more organic for Rocky. DiCola later said he was certain he had no chance. The odds were probably something like 100,000 to 1. He competed against the legacy of the most recognizable theme in boxing movie history and delivered something completely different that defined the film's sound just as completely. Gonna Fly Now appears nowhere in Rocky IV except in brief fragments woven into the training montage. That absence is itself a statement about how far from home Rocky is, and how different this fight is from everything that came before. Listen for it the next time you watch the training sequence. The ghost of Conti's theme is almost there, and then it is gone. Dolph Lundgren's absence from the hospital, on the other hand, was definitely not planned. Number 7. The punches in the final fight between Rocky and Drago look brutal. In the early portion of the fight, some of them genuinely were. Stallone made a decision early in production that would land him in a hospital. He told Lundgren to actually hit him. He wanted the impact to read as real on camera, and Lundgren had 5 years of competitive full-contact karate behind him. Stallone reportedly told him to cut loose completely. A Lundgren blow struck Stallone's chest so hard it caused dangerous swelling of the heart against the breastbone. Stallone's blood pressure reportedly climbed above 200. He was flown from Vancouver to a hospital in Santa Monica and spent several days in intensive care. Production shut down entirely. Lundgren has said he was simply following orders. Stallone later reflected, "I told him, just try to knock me out. Really cut loose as hard as you can." That was a really stupid thing to say. The accounts vary on specific details. Producer Irwin Winkler's memoir has at one point attributed the critical punch to a stand-in, while Stallone and Lundgren both credit Lundgren directly. The hospitalization is not in dispute. What is also not in dispute is that the punch is reportedly in the finished film. The reactions you see Stallone selling are not entirely acting. The off-camera friction between the film's leads was not limited to what happened to Stallone. Carl Weathers reportedly had his own incident with Lundgren that very nearly stopped production again. Number 6. Carl Weathers arrived on the Rocky IV set as a franchise veteran. He had played Apollo Creed through 3 films, knew the character as well as anyone, and was returning for what would be his most dramatically significant scene in the series. What he encountered was Dolph Lundgren, a 6'6" karate champion who had never made a real film and who arrived into the scene with considerably more force than Weathers expected, per Stallone's account in a 2006 Ain't It Cool News interview. Lundgren picked Weathers up and physically threw him into a ring corner during the shoot. Weathers got out of the ring and, according to Stallone, said something along the lines of, "I'm calling my agent, I quit." Stallone had to step in and mediate before filming could resume. Lundgren has said he stayed in character and that Weathers, who had arrived only 2 days before shooting began, was understandably wary of a first-time actor with a martial arts background who had already sent the director to the hospital. Worth noting, Weathers himself later told British GQ that the friction was overblown and that Lundgren was just a sweet guy. Whether the incident was serious or a conflict that resolved quickly, it points to the tension of putting a combat athlete into a contained film set. That tension fed the on-screen intensity of Apollo's final fight, and Stallone's decision to make that fight Apollo's last one was entirely his own call. Number 5. Apollo Creed dying in Rocky's arms is the emotional center of Rocky IV. It is also the creative decision Stallone spent decades second-guessing. The death was entirely Stallone's call as writer-director. Carl Weathers was not informed going into production that Apollo would die. That was a late creative decision. Stallone has said he made the choice because he needed the audience to genuinely hate Drago, and nothing would accomplish that like killing the franchise's most beloved supporting character. He later acknowledged the cost of that decision. Killing Apollo was going to make people really angry at Drago, but it also sabotaged me, Stallone said, because I couldn't replace him. He told Weathers at some point that he could have found another way, a back injury, a mentor role from the corner, something that kept the character alive. Stallone has called Weathers' performance in the death scene Oscar-worthy and has described him as irreplaceable. The relationship between them became complicated later, when Weathers wanted an active role rather than flashback footage in Rocky Balboa and did not get one. The 2021 director's cut expands Apollo's funeral and adds a full eulogy delivered by Duke. The impact of the death in that version is considerably heavier. And Apollo's death is the scene that launched the entire Creed franchise. Michael B. Jordan's Adonis Creed is the direct legacy of a creative choice Stallone made in 1985 and spent years regretting. Speaking of choices Stallone made in editing, some of Drago's most iconic lines were the result of a very deliberate subtraction. Number 4. If he dies, he dies. I must break you. He is not human. He is like a piece of iron. These are the lines that made Ivan Drago one of cinema's most quoted villains. Together, they add up to perhaps 20 words across a 91-minute film. That minimalism was the result of a deliberate directorial decision. Stallone originally wrote considerably more dialogue for Drago. As editing progressed, he slashed it. He had realized that every line Drago spoke made the character smaller. The silence was more terrifying than the speech. A villain who barely explains himself forces the audience to project threat onto every gesture, every posture, every flat-eyed stare. Lundgren leaned into this without difficulty. His background in physical performance, rooted in martial arts competition rather than acting training, made stillness his default mode. He moved with the economy of an athlete, not the expressiveness of a performer. The result is that Drago's few lines land with the weight of actual statements of fact rather than dramatic villainy. When he says he is not human, it does not read like a taunt, it reads like a scouting report. The entire character is a lesson in the power of withholding. And Drago appears in a film that is itself built around withholding, short, tight, structured almost entirely around images and music rather than words. Which brings us to what Rocky IV actually is when you look at it from the inside out. Number 3. Rocky IV runs 91 minutes in its original theatrical release. That makes it the shortest entry in the original Rocky series, and a significant portion of those 91 minutes is montage. Count them: the Rocky III recap montage that opens the film, the Rocky Drago split-screen training comparison, the Hearts on Fire snow training sequence, the No Easy Way Out guilt drive-through flashbacks, and the final fight. By some estimates, the film contains more montage footage than any other installment in the franchise. The opening recap reuses footage from the previous film. The Guilt Drive montage draws from earlier Rocky entries. Editors Don Zimmerman and John W. Wheeler cut the film lean and fast, calibrated for an MTV era that rewarded images over dialogue. Stallone has acknowledged that his original cut was roughly an hour longer. He described the impulse to re-edit old work as instinct. It's not about making a movie, it's about remaking. That instinct eventually produced the 2021 director's cut, which added nearly 40 minutes of material while changing the film's emotional priorities. In the theatrical version, Rocky IV plays like a feature-length music video. Filmmakers of a later generation absorbed that lesson whether they knew where it came from or not. Pay attention to how much of the film's emotional information is delivered by music and image rather than dialogue. It is a genuinely unusual construction, and it shaped what action-era blockbusters looked like for the next decade. The 2021 re-edit changed more than just the length. Number 2. In November 2021, Stallone released Rocky IV, Rocky vs. Drago, a re-edited version of the film that had a single-night theatrical event before landing on home video. He had promised to do this for years, and the result was a significantly different movie. Every single scene featuring Seiko the robot was removed. Stallone's explanation was direct: the robot is going to the junkyard forever. Robert Dornick, who built Seiko and claimed the character was a SAG-represented performer, said the cuts may have been partly motivated by residual obligations. Stallone maintained it was simply a creative decision to keep the film tonally serious. What was added? A longer Rocky III recap, an expanded Apollo Creed funeral with a full eulogy delivered by Duke, a boxing commission scene, additional Drago scenes exploring his psychology, and more dialogue for Adrian, the Gorbachev lookalike who famously stands to applaud Rocky's final speech in the 1985 version, now remains seated. The Soviet leadership leaves instead of being won over. The director's cut runs approximately 93 to 94 minutes, slightly longer than the theatrical version despite cutting substantial material, and aligns the film much more closely with the Creed franchise's treatment of Apollo's legacy. Watch both versions, and you are watching the same footage become two different movies. The 1985 cut is Reagan-era triumphalism. The 2021 cut is a meditation on friendship and loss. The politics of the film's release, though, belong to an even bigger story. Number 1. Rocky IV premiered in Westwood, Los Angeles on November 21, 1985. On that same date, the Reagan-Gorbachev Geneva Summit, the first face-to-face meeting between the two leaders, concluded after 3 days of talks that were widely reported as the beginning of a thaw in superpower relations. The timing was accidental, and yet somehow perfect. President Ronald Reagan screened Rocky IV at Camp David, according to Mark Weinberg's memoir Movie Nights with the Reagans. Reagan had long considered Stallone a significant Hollywood supporter and was reportedly enthusiastic about the fight scenes. The Soviet premiere in the film was played by look-alike David Lloyd Austin, who had also played Gorbachev in The Naked Gun. The cultural mythology around the film extends further. The suggestion that a boxing movie helped thaw the Cold War is, of course, exactly that. Mythology, the Soviet Union's eventual collapse, was the product of economic dysfunction, the Afghanistan War, and Mikhail Gorbachev's glasnost and perestroika reforms. Rocky Balboa did not negotiate those. What the film did was capture something the culture was ready to believe, that individual will, applied with enough conviction, could change the minds of people who had been told they were enemies. Rocky IV earned $127 million domestically and over $300 million worldwide on a $28 million budget. It remains the highest-grossing entry in the original series, and Stallone delivered his "If I Can Change" speech to a Canadian cattle barn full of coached volunteers. Rocky IV was never supposed to be more than a crowd-pleasing sequel. Instead, it became a Cold War time capsule built by a man who cast his real fiancée, wrote a robot into the script for his son, spent days in intensive care after a real punch, and then stood in Wyoming snow screaming at a mountain. Behind the thundering score and the glossy montages was something genuinely personal that Stallone spent 4 decades rethinking. Now you know what it actually cost to make. If this video surprised you, drop your favorite fact in the comments. Like, subscribe, and share this with someone who loves this movie as much as you do. And as always, if I can change, and you can change, everybody can change. We'll see you next time.